as I tried to show this morning, the concepts and frameworks that we worked through, that we developed or that we got familiarized with, I think are very important. Are very important for me now as a policymaker. Okay. So it's the transition hasn't been that hard, because I mean it does make a difference to be in a situation where you're struggling to be heard, yeah. That's a big difference from being in the seat where yeah. the decisions can be made. So you short-circuit the process.
Was it because the government at that time must have been a very right-wing government?
Yeah, the government really, you have to remember that in El Salvador, environmental issues were really not something, well, the Ministry of the Environment was more like an external creation. It was born with external support. And so environmental issues were seen as a way to get money. But they were not really seriously taken up. But as civil society also took up these issues, then the pressure on the government grew. But the government really didn't really respond seriously to this issue. So after 20 years of this same party government, when in June the 1st the new government took over, 2009, okay. Yeah, that's 19 months, 10 days ago.
Oh, that's the time you gave me in the morning.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, 19 months. It's June the 1st.
Okay.
June the 1st, and it's a fixed term, 5-year term. Okay. And so there was these huge expectations for change. And of course, one of the changes that were expected by many people is that finally environmental issues will be taken seriously and they will be addressed.
But that would imply, Minister, that environmentalism is a mass movement in Salvador.
It is an important issue. Okay. It is an important issue. I wouldn't go as far as call it a mass movement. Mm-hmm. Somehow the country got late into the game, as it were. Mm-hmm. The peace accords were signed in the same year of the Rio summit, mm-hmm. in 1992. Mm-hmm. So during the whole of the 80s, the single most important issue was the civil war and how it would end, and so in a way the country lagged behind. But I think these days, given on the other hand, El Salvador is in an extreme situation. So the choices are far more stark, and that makes it easier to have a conversation about these issues.
And is that the way it is? That's an interesting way of looking at it. That if you have stark choices, you willy-nilly have to talk.
Exactly, because it's we got to the point where our landscape is so degraded that when we have an extreme event, I mean, that translates almost immediately into flooding, landslides, all kinds of disasters.
How much how much did the war destroy your environment?
Actually, the war allowed some recuperation.
Okay, because
there were some regions where you couldn't do anything, you couldn't cultivate. For instance, in the coastal area in the 60s and 70s, there was a significant expansion of cotton production, and there was a massive use of pesticides. You actually found DDT in mother's milk. So, and during the war, cotton production disappeared, and as a result, the soil began to recover. We still have some groundwater contamination from that period.
Is there no cotton cultivation now?
No, not anymore.
Wow, since when?
Since cotton production collapsed at the end of the 70s, at the beginning of the 80s, it had practically disappeared. It didn't collapse only because of the war. It was because the prices plummeted, and the use of pesticides was so intensive that the cost of productions were quite high. So it just becomes it was no longer profitable, and the pest resistance was so high that they couldn't produce cotton without using so much pesticide. So I think being in an extreme situation, in a borderline situation, can actually be quite good to push these changes, because it's much more difficult to mask the problem.
Okay. How did you become a minister? Are you a member of any of the parties?
Actually, 3 weeks before the new government took over, I was still trying to influence the transition team. Because I thought this was a great opportunity to make some changes. And they wouldn't reply my emails, they wouldn't answer my phone calls. But I had worked with one of the closest advisors of the president, and who is now the chief of the Economic and Social Cabinet. And 2 weeks before the new government took office, I got a phone call, and I was asked if I was willing to become the minister. And actually, I didn't expect it, and I said, look, I didn't get into this for environment's sake. For me, this environment was an entry door to discuss larger social and economic issues. Okay. And this person said, no, look, I know what you think. What I need right now is that you tell me if you're willing to take up this position. So it was so it was quite unexpected. But of course, once I got into the driver's seat, after a few bumps, I just had to learn to ride.
Was there any popular support for this move? Because you have been a kind of crusader?
Actually, no. I mean, I remember that PRISMA is and still is. It's not an activist organization. It's more like an applied research organization, no? So many people had doubts. I mean, how I would perform, and actually, someone said, "We never seen Herman marching, and he hasn't been an activist." and some other people said, actually from the right-wing press, he said, he's quiet, he's not aggressive, and he might do well. So I don't think that was good for me.
Certification from the wrong people.
Exactly, but I mean, it's one has to balance things. I mean, it's when you are in government, you have to be able to know and measure the space you're operating, and actually, my expectations in that sense for change were quite moderate. Okay. And my surprise has been that we have been able to achieve more than what I initially expected, and it has to do with the context. And the disasters the country has suffered somehow have made it easier for me to make my point, and so I can have a much more profound conversation that I would have had otherwise. So what we have already achieved in these past 19 months was pretty much my expectation for the whole 5 years. So but again, I started with very low expectations. I mean, it's not because it didn't mean that because this was a socially progressive government that it was progressive also on environmental issues, most of the members of the cabinet they simply didn't think about these issues. So there is a learning process, and you have to be willing to see the opportunities when you can move faster, and do not despair if things don't actually actually I had an interesting experience. I remember about 3 months after we took office, I asked for space in a cabinet meeting to discuss risk reduction, since that was our top priority. Risk reduction. I would talk about risks. Yeah. Okay. So they told me, you have 10 minutes. Okay. So I just made a couple of points. I said, look, the main cause, the main source of risks in this country has been public policy, either by action or inaction. And we have the responsibility to change that dynamic in our public policy. So I gave a couple of examples and so on. Nobody said anything, and we just moved to the next point in the agenda. But November the 8th, after the landslide and 200 dead, we were at the presidential palace in shirt sleeves, okay? No formal dress, okay? With the president, with the other ministers. And the conversation began to change from that moment. So I didn't have to argue it any longer. I mean, reality is always the best teacher.
Let me come back to a very interesting statement you made. You said, I'm not here for just environment. I use environment as a gateway for larger social and maybe economic issues like livelihood. Can you just explain your philosophy, Minister?
Well, by that what I mean is, and that's why I think the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Framework, I think it's a good one. There is a critical link between ecosystems and human well-being. Okay, and that goes both ways. It's not that people depend from ecosystems, but the health of ecosystems depend on what people do and how they organize themselves. So we felt that since we had come out from a very polarized situation, that looking at environmental issues could allow us to bring everyone to the table and start discussing, for instance, at that time, the government was strongly pushing for structural adjustment reforms. Okay, trade liberalization, deregulation, and so on. So that meant that you could not have a conversation about economic policy because the situation was polarized. Or you were in favor of those economic reforms, or you were against. There was no middle ground. But when you start looking at environmental issues, and in our case, the dynamics of the economic degradation, one could establish the linkages between those economic policies and the dynamics that we're creating. So that opened up a different space to discuss economic policies. So it's a roundabout way, but a roundabout way that creates less resistance. In the end, what is important, I mean, what affects, most people are affected not by environmental policy. They are affected by economic and social policies. So if you don't change those policies, then things will not improve. But looking at environmental issues, looking through the social environmental lens at those policies, I think opens up a way to push for some changes. Okay, it's like what's happening now, for instance, in our own case. Since we equate environmental problems to risk issues, that allows us to, for instance, discuss, we're doing at this moment, for instance, a strategic assessment on biofuels, because there has been some interest from some parties to promote biofuels and ethanol production from sugarcane in El Salvador.
Is it one of your main crops?
No, sugarcane it's an important crop, okay. But producing ethanol from sugarcane would require an expansion of that crop. So before the government made a decision on that policy, I got the agreement that we would do a strategic environmental assessment.
Okay.
And when we look at what
Did the
could...
government itself ask you to do this? Or did you say you will do
it? We have an energy cabinet,
okay,
which is where I have a seat. And I got an agreement from the energy cabinet that we would do a strategic assessment before defining the policy, strategic environmental assessment. And the agreement also says that a strategic assessment would be done under the leadership of the Ministry of the Environment. So, so we looked at current production technologies that are used, and what will be then the impact of an expansion of sugarcane for ethanol. And the conclusions are that it would be very risky to do that. So, because of the impact on groundwater, on critical ecosystems, and food security, because of competition with areas where you grow food crops and so on. So what is coming out of the strategic environmental evaluation is some guidelines, territorial guidelines, and production guidelines. It's okay. Where we're not saying no, absolutely no. What we're saying, if you want to expand sugarcane production, you can only do it in these areas where you will, threaten water resources. And first, we will have to change existing production patterns so that they don't use as much pesticides, so that they don't burn the sugarcane, and so on. So it's
You said it came out with two guidelines. One was territorial, and that was
territorial guidelines and production guidelines. For instance, the current production scheme is very polluting. So unless you clean up that first, it doesn't make sense to expand it. Right. And we're saying, okay, once you clean it up, even then, there are some areas where you cannot no go. But there are areas where it is possible.
Okay.
So,
so what's the reaction? Was it a foreign funded project, or was it a domestic?
No.
Domestic?
Since this is a policy discussion, okay.
Nothing specific as a project.
No. This is and basically these guidelines now will have. These results need yet to be formalized. Okay. I still have to present them formally to the Energy Cabinet, and if they are approved, then that will be the framework to define biofuels policy in El Salvador. So. So that's one way of how we're approaching the different policies. This, by the way, is the instruments that we're applying, they are in the environmental law. But these things had never been developed. So basically, I'm not doing anything really, that is not already there. What I'm doing is I'm taking seriously the legal framework that I have. And so I'm trying to develop the different instruments that are provided for the law.
Right. Yesterday, were you there when our minister?
Yeah, and then he was making the point. And because generally I think most countries do not have bad environmental laws, but there is a tendency not to develop them. Okay, and they are approved, and then nobody takes full responsibility for implementing them. Right. So so I have acquired something that I never thought would happen, which is a greater love for lawyers.
Why is that?
Because before I thought, well, and it was really so, that it didn't matter whatever laws we had. It didn't make a difference. Now, the law is one of my most important instruments. And so I'm constantly talking to our lawyers and how we can further refine or how we can use what we have to push our agenda. And since no minister will actually tell you that he's willing to defy the law, because when you're sworn in, you make a pledge to respect the law, then oftentimes what I say, look, you have to do that. It's in the law.
But I really envy you, because we have our good laws and they're constantly challenged. They're open to interpretation, and you will find so many of the issues. In fact, there was some assessment made that more than 2/3 of the cases in courts relate to environmental issues because of projects being held up. So in your case, in Salvador, things seem to be very clear-cut. Here it is not.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we are in a transition, okay? And we might get to that point, okay, where people will want to push their cases through the courts. But I think we just have to make sure we choose the right battles, okay? And we choose battles where the evidence is so overwhelming that it will be terribly bad publicity to use the courts to try to push your case, and most likely you will lose the case anyway. So it's like but it makes things are made easier when the choices are quite stark, as I said at the beginning. I mean, it's when the situation is not so clear, and people are more willing to assume the trade-offs involved, then it's not so easy.
You keep talking about the great environmental degradation in Salvador. What caused it actually? It was not war, it was... Is it just extreme events, or
no? There is El Salvador has a long history of environmental degradation. The landscape was radically transformed to introduce export crops.
Okay.
Okay, so for instance, natural forests practically disappeared, and they were substituted by crops such as coffee, that at one time was our main export. Then with increasing urbanization, contamination has become a very serious issue. In a recent sample we did of surface water, not a single sample had excellent quality. And not even good quality. So it went from regular to, I don't know how you say the adjective, it's when it's really, really bad. And we have problems also because of heavy use of pesticides. We have groundwater contamination in certain areas, and that's a very serious problem, health problem. There are areas where the prevalence of kidney disease is very high because of that. And now in the metropolitan area of San Salvador, air pollution is becoming also an important problem. So when you add up the health costs and other costs, that turns out to be very costly. That's why I said that environmental problems are not just a social concern, that they got to the point where they are a very serious economic concern. For instance, these days many people want to launch, to strengthen the local economy. In many places they think of tourism as a important avenue to explore. But if your rivers are contaminated, if you have serious solid waste collection problems, and obviously you will not be able to create an attractive setting for tourism. And so we always try to make those linkages, that if you really want to address health problems, if you really want to strengthen the local economy, the only way you can do it is by addressing environmental problems. So that's how we link, and that's why we say environment as an entry point. Because obviously you want to strengthen the local economy. You want to solve social problems, and addressing environmental problems is one very significant way to advance those objectives. So what we're not willing to do is advance environmental objectives by environment's sake. Okay, for us, environment, you always have to link it to people. And that's why in the framework we developed before, we put people in the center. That's why also we worry about a certain fetishism that you have regarding trees, for instance. Okay. Because oftentimes associated to that is exclusion of people. Okay? To keep the trees, you exclude people. so if you're going to put people at the center, then what you have to stress is the actual practices that people have that allow to maintain the ecosystems. Oftentimes you put the environmental objective so much up front that you end up putting up schemes that turn out to be very perverse. For instance, the World Bank supported in El Salvador a project that was called Coffee and Biodiversity.
Sounds interesting. What is it?
Well, the thing is, in our country, the coffee varieties that are used need shade. So a coffee farm can be quite a complex ecosystem. And so because it can provide an important habitat for birds and so on. So in this project, because they had to measure and get a baseline and measure and certify, they ended up excluding smaller farms. Okay? Because you need a certain economy of scale. But it was in the smaller farms where you had the greatest biodiversity. Okay? Because they use a far greater variety of trees.
Okay.
And so on. So, but since your objective is biodiversity, you make that choice. If your objective is strengthening livelihoods,
No,
you would have focused.
I'm a little puzzled. If the World Bank project left out the smaller farmers, then nothing happened to those projects, right?
Yeah, they were excluded.
So that's fine, because they have the greater biodiversity.
No, but what I'm saying is that those are the ones that needed greater support.
Oh, financial support.
Exactly.
Okay.
But in many, and that happens also with carbon sequestration, and all RED and all that. You're so worried about the baselines and the monitoring and getting all that, that in the end, not only you do not achieve your environmental objectives, but your projects tend to exclude the poor. That's why I think it is important that the first and foremost consideration is people.
That would pit you against a lot of environmentalists, because a lot of environmentalists, including maybe our own center, believes that environment is also just important. There are issues, people-nature conflicts are there. So it's a difficult thing to resolve by saying it's only people.
No, I'm not saying it's only people. What I'm saying is that people should be at the center, okay? And there cannot be human well-being without healthy ecosystems, okay? And but what we're saying is that ecosystems that are supposedly healthy, by excluding people, that doesn't make sense. Okay, it is deliberately an anthropocentric perspective. Okay, some people think that nature has rights by itself. Okay, given our social problems, we think we have to make a very strong linkage between people and ecosystems, and that our choices have to be made in such a way that you achieve simultaneously the objective of strengthening livelihoods and improving the management of the resource base. And we don't think you need to make a trade-off. You have to seek a way to advance both at the same time.
Improve livelihoods
and improve the management of the resource base and improve natural resource management.
Okay. There's another statement that our minister made yesterday. He says there's always a trade-off, but the decisions are always political. You keep emphasizing social. Is there a difference?
Well, what I mean, yeah, I mean a social decision. Okay, how that social decision is made? Is it made through the political system? Or does it involve other levels? Okay, but definitely there are trade-offs involved. For instance, if you want to get more provisioning services, such as food, or, then that might mean that you may lose some other services. Okay? And you cannot be absolute about that. Transforming the landscape is a necessity, but society has to decide on what a transformation can be, what are the boundaries, what are the limits you establish, what are the things you need to guarantee. And those decisions are made, okay? Those are social decisions. So the key issue is how democratically are those decisions made. But they are always social decisions, okay? They might be made by a small elite, or they might be made more broadly. But they're never technical decisions. They're always social decisions.
So in a sense, your concept is a little broader because you're talking of society. Whereas when our minister says political, it means only the government.
I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't dare to interpret him, okay? Because for many people, the political process is much more than just the government. What it means is when you have a broad debate about these issues, that is part of the political process. So it's and my point is that since ecosystem change is inevitable and human-induced change is inevitable, then there needs to be a very broad discussion on that. Because you need to put some boundaries on that, okay? And it's what we're discussing also. I mean, it's like the climate change issue. That's a political issue, okay? Or is what is the concentration of greenhouse gases that we will, what will be our target? Is 370 parts per million? Is 450? Will it be 1800, 800, and we all be there? What will be? What will be?
So what is your view then, Minister, on what happened at Cancun?
Well,
because people like Morales,
yeah,
who actually spoke for many of our countries,
Mhm.
was sidelined.
But the thing is, you need to compare Cancun to Copenhagen. Okay, Copenhagen.
But is that correct really? Because you say Copenhagen, nothing happened, Cancun, there was an agreement. But then you have to look at what kind of agreement was
Okay, the thing is, you are working under the United Nations. That's the first thing one has to remember. Under the United Nations, all countries have a voice. Okay, and there are 193 parties involved, and Cancun was important, and Cancun also reflects a problem that we have. Okay. The problem has to do with the fact that we're not advancing the mitigation agenda. Okay? We're not getting the kind of commitments the world needs to avoid disastrous climate change, although climate change is already disastrous. But what I mean is, But Cancun managed to advance the adaptation agenda. Okay. Also in Cancun, we reached agreement on some mechanisms, financial mechanism, technology mechanism, that will operate under the convention, under the mandate of the convention. Okay. And given the problem that climate change already is, most parties were simply not willing to throw away the baby with the bathwater. And of course, many compromises were made. But that's the way you operate under the United Nations. Okay? It's like when you pass a law in the parliament. Any law is a result of a compromise. Okay? But, for instance, just because I don't have the environmental law that I should have, that doesn't mean that I should throw away what we have, what I have. Mm-hmm. So it's and one has to come to terms with the idea that this is a process, and that it will probably take a major global disaster to really bring home the message that we need to be much more serious about this problem. In the meantime, we cannot afford to be with our, we cannot afford just to do nothing. And the kind of things that we need to do in terms of adaptation do require a significant flow of resources. And in that sense, both the adaptation framework that was agreed in Cancun and the instruments that were created can help in that way. So, as much as I respect the brothers of Bolivia, I think their position was untenable. It's you are operating under the United Nations, and decisions are taken by consensus. It definitely Cancun set a precedent because consensus was interpreted as being different from unanimity, and that's the way the agreement was taken.
Can I just ask you a couple of last questions? You spoke about your country losing all local varieties of potato?
No. I was talking about Peru. Peru. Okay. Peru still have significant indigenous groups.
Okay.
And because of the Green Revolution, many communities abandoned their traditional practices, and in the process, potatoes varieties began to diminish. Potato is a basic food crop in the Andes.
Okay.
And I was given, I was using that example simply to show that there are some ecosystem services that are simply impossible without human intervention. Okay, this is, without people, you cannot have genetic diversity. You cannot guarantee the genetic diversity of potato. And it goes back to my point that I do not subscribe to the idea that people are the problem.
Okay. So, what is your country's stance on genetically modified foods?
So far, again, we think that's a risky proposition.
Why? Biological diversity?
Let me give you an example. When Hurricane Stan struck, one of the findings of a work that was done in an area that had been affected was that native varieties of corn.
When was Hurricane Stan?
That was in 2005.
It struck all of Latin America?
No, it was affected Guatemala and El Salvador.
Okay.
But lots of rain, flooding, and so on. So usually when it rains too much, then the crops are damaged because of the increased humidity. But in this case, the native varieties
Of corn?
turn out to be far more resistant. So one avenue for adaptation to climate change is to explore and probably expand, recuperate native varieties, as a way to increase the resiliency. So NGOs somehow they go into another direction. So basically, what we're saying is, I mean, we're facing.
Can I just ask, in your economy, is agriculture the main contributor to GDP?
No, no. Our main export is people.
What?
People.
Can you explain that?
El Salvador, for decades, has been a country of out-migration.
Okay.
And during the war, many people left the country. And after the war, because of the economy really didn't take off, people continued to leave. So remittances is the main source of foreign exchange. Right. So it's a remittance-driven economy. Agriculture has practically collapsed, and export agriculture is no longer an important source of foreign exchange. So
what about food security? How do you look at agriculture?
Food security is becoming an important issue. For instance, the last year, because of this intense and concentrated rainfall, kidney bean crops were deeply affected, and kidney beans is an important foodstuff. Okay, we eat kidney beans every day. Okay,
That's sweet.
Okay, and it's staple food, an important source of protein, and we don't just eat any kidney beans. We eat particular red kidney beans, which are not produced broadly. It's not a tradable commodity in international markets. And normally what we did is that national production was not enough, so we imported kidney beans from Nicaragua, a neighboring country. But last year, the crops were damaged both in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Oh, you traditionally import from Nicaragua?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And so prices went through the roof. Okay. And so one of the considerations that we need to make regarding food security is that, given these uncertainties, as part of our climate change adaptation plan, we will need to explore this in a much more profound manner. And I would argue that we need to guarantee our self-sufficiency in terms of these basic foodstuffs. And that means that we have to use appropriate varieties, that we will need to identify those areas of the countries that can be less affected by extreme events so that these crops will survive. And so that takes us into a different conservation, about a different conversation about the role of agriculture.